John Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back. Before we get into the episode, just want to let you know that this is the free version of the podcast, and all that means is that we are way behind where I'm at in Patreon. So if you are loving this podcast and you need more John Constantine in your life, definitely go check us out at patreon.com/planes, trains, and comic books and sign up for the Hellblazer tier, where you'll get access to the entire Hellblazer library that I've recorded so far. And also you'll get access to the exclusive episodes of the Planes, Trains, and Comic Books main podcast. So if any of that sounds good to you, definitely go over to patreon.com/planes, trains, and comic books, all one word, and sign up there. And with that out of the way, let's get into the issue. Today we are reading Hellblazer number 56. And just a little recap on what have been going on in the last couple issues. Last time we finished the storyline known as Royal Blood. And in that story, John Constantine removed a demon from Prince Charles that was put there by a man named Marston, who was kind of like a government fixer. And the reason he did that is because he was hoping that with the demon in power, Britain could return to its old natural state of being the dominant force in the world. And of course, John couldn't let that happen, so he removed the demon from Prince Charles and instead put it inside Marston for being such a horrible person, and Marston ended up eating himself alive. And once that was done, then John cast the demon and Marston's soul back to hell, where the demon proceeded to torture Marston for the rest of eternity. And that is where we left off on the last issue. So first things first, with the cover of issue 56, we see there is a man running from a pen. And it's not a new pen, it's one of those old pens that have like an ink nib on the tip of it that you would dip or pour ink into. And this man is running on what looks like the pages of a diary as the pen is about to come down and stab him. And in the background, we can see John Constantine's giant face looking down on the tiny man running on the pages. It doesn't seem like he is the writer, but it definitely looks like he's not happy with the man. And we also see that this issue was written by Garth Ennis with art by David Lloyd, who has not been the normal artist on this series, but we did see him during the Grant Morrison storyline. I believe that was issues 25 and 26, if I'm not mistaken. And he is also the artist on the book V for Vendetta. And he's got a pretty awesome style, so it's nice to see him on the book again. So as we turn to page 1, we see that there is a full page splash of a diary, and this is like an old school traditional diary where there's actually like a strap with a lock on it so you could lock it so people couldn't read it. And on the cover it says, "This is the diary of Danny Drake." And we get some narration that says, "Danny Drake couldn't keep anything to himself. Secrets stewed inside him like poison and wound him till he was mad with anxiety. Christ, he always had to tell someone, so he wrote it all down. Whatever he did and how he felt about it, even that August night when the floor ran slick with something pink and warm. And wasn't it so much better to get everything off his chest?" Then we cut to the subway tubes where a train is speeding along on the tracks. And we see inside the train, there's a bunch of people sitting down like normal. And one of those people that's being focused on is a young white man with long blonde hair. And to me, he looks like he's dressed pretty interestingly for England especially. And in the 80s, he kind of looks like he's from Texas because he's got like jeans on and a white button-up shirt. He's got a belt with a giant belt buckle. He also has one of those bolo ties. And we don't see his feet, but I wouldn't be surprised if he was wearing cowboy boots. So over these panels, there's some narration that says, "Danny doesn't like the tube. Normally he wouldn't go near it, but last night he lost control of the BMW. He just couldn't stop screaming, and he wrapped it around a lamppost. So the tube it is. He would say things can't get any worse, but he knows they can, and they will, right now." So obviously the man I was describing was Danny. So Danny stands up in the middle of the train and begins yelling, "I'm a whoremonger." And of course people look up, And of course, there's varied reactions. Some people pretend not to look up and they look like they're continuing reading their newspaper, but they're not. Some people are scared and they're just staring at their newspaper. Some people are laughing. Some people just look worried. And of course, there are some people that are angry. And he's running to a bunch of different of these people and yelling in their faces, I used to drive to King's Cross or down to the embankment. I picked up women. I paid for it. It was when Daphne was pregnant. I wanted it so bad. I caught the clap and I had to go to the clinic. And then one man yells, "Will you shut up for Christ's sake?" And then he gets right in that guy's face and says, "I can't shut up, you stupid bastard. I can't." And then he wheels around and begins yelling in the middle of the crowd again. And also in this panel, we see there is a man who's not paying any attention to this, and he's standing in the background. And of course, it is John Constantine. He is reading a newspaper, and he doesn't even look up as the man continues. "And the pain, it just didn't stop. I just went back for more screwing sluts in alleys, and goddamn me, more." So Danny runs past all these people, and he runs to the doors. He begins beating on them, saying, "Oh, let me out." And almost like he's being compelled to speak, he continues with his story, saying, "And Daphne found out, just like she found my grimorium, and she called me a shit, a dirty little shit." And as he's pounding on the doors, they pull up to the next station, and the doors open, and he runs out saying, "Thank Christ." And as the man runs away, we see the newspaper from John Constantine kind of tilt down, and he watches the man running through the train station, and he thinks to himself, Grimorium. And we can see that this word has piqued John's interest because we have heard of this word before. The Grimorium is the book of spells or occultic stuff that they've mentioned a couple times in this series. So John gets off at the same stop now that he's interested, and he begins to walk after the man. And as the man gets outside, he leans against a brick wall, and he's saying to himself, just like last time, is this punishment? And then he leans back against the wall and loosens his bolo tie and collar as he tries to get some air. But that doesn't work out too well because immediately as he's breathing deep, John Constantine comes around the corner and he lights a cigarette, and he answers Danny's question about this being a punishment, saying, "Bloody silly one if it is, mate. You looked a right arsehole." And Danny gets mad at this, saying, "Piss off. What the frick do you know about it?" And John looks at him and says, "Well, I know what your book is. The one you said Daphne found, all about a very nasty place and the people who live there, and how to speak to them. Start talking." And Danny's attitude goes from angry to sad desperation as he watches John say this. So he ends up talking to John, and they end up walking to a town called Muswell Hill, where Danny lives, and we get some narration from John saying, "He says he's Danny Drake. I'd have been happy to talk in a pub, but he wants to go home. Sodding walk to Muswell Hill knackers me." And as the two men are walking, we see Danny saying, "I've got to get back to my house. When I freak out again, I don't want people to see me. I really hope I can trust you." And as they reach Danny's house, John looks around and he says, "Oh, for sure. Ask anyone." So they go into Danny's house, and in the living room, John's looking around at all the stuff, and he takes note that there's a lot of fancy things and antiques and whatnot around the house. And John's narration says, "Art lover, fine tastes, but he smokes enough dope to raise the dead." And as John takes a seat on the couch, Danny says he'll make some coffee. And once that's done, John is sitting down drinking that with Danny as they talk. And John's narration says, "He drops the cups once and the sugar bowl twice while he's making it. Not a good sign." And then we jump into Danny talking, saying, "It just seems so insane. But I suppose you're used to hearing strange stuff. I'm being haunted by my diary." And at this, John kind of almost takes a spit take, and he says, "Your diary? Why? You've been seeing someone behind its back?" And at this, Danny gets all serious and says, "Please don't joke. I must have been keeping a diary for over 10 years now. It was always such a relief to have somewhere to put all my secrets, you know? To stop them nagging at me. That was what the diary was for. It became like a friend, a mate I could trust with anything. I did pretty well in the 80s, playing the markets and so on. And there was Daphne too. Well, before she left. And they were good times. We'd sit and go over them together and have a laugh. Me and the diary, I mean." And then John cuts him off asking, "What about Daphne?" And Danny answers, Well, my wife walked out on me a few years back. I've met someone else since, though. That's where the trouble started." So in this section, we get a flashback of him telling the story of the woman that he met and the trouble that started, and Danny continues his story. Ophelia was 1 in a million. First of all, she was gorgeous, a real looker, you know, and I didn't think she'd want much to do with me, but she did. So we see the woman he's talking about is a white woman who has dark black hair. She just looks like your average, young, attractive 80s, early 90s woman. And in the panels, we're seeing him notice her at a party, and then immediately they're having sex. So it seemed like their relationship progressed rather quickly. And Danny continues his story. You know, I used to prefer what we did afterwards to the sex itself. And John kind of perks up and says, oh? And Danny answers, we talked. And John kind of chuckles because I think he thought what Danny was talking about was going to be super salacious, but it was just talking, and I think John was caught off guard by that. So we get some panels of Danny and Ophelia staring at each other in bed after they've finished having sex, and Danny's story continues. That was the other thing about Fee. She was such a good listener. I could tell her anything, even some of the stuff from my old diary, and she wouldn't mind. She was the one I went to when I felt depressed or guilty or rotten. She sheltered me. And after a while, well, who needed a diary with Fee around? So then we get a panel of Danny taking his diaries and burning them. And he's got multiple diaries because, like he said, he'd been writing for 10 years or so. So all that isn't going to fit in one book. So he's literally throwing a pile of diaries in this fireplace. And John kind of interrupts Danny's story saying, yeah, I think I've twigged what's coming next. And Danny continues, I know it was stupid, but I thought it would do me good. I didn't have to record my life like I was some schoolboy or something. I could talk to a real person. And then he looks up at John very sad and he says, then she left me. And we cut to a flashback panel of Danny sitting on his bed alone, almost like he's huddled in fear because he's brought his knees to his chest and he looks very worried. And his narration continues. She said she liked me, but I was too feeble. She said what I needed was someone to kick me into gear rather than a shoulder to cry on. Jesus, what did she mean? I was so miserable I forgot the diary completely. The first time it happened, I was on the phone. Then we get a flashback of that moment where he was on the phone with someone and he's saying, I don't know, Robin. I might pop in. Yeah, maybe it would be good for me to go to a party, but, Robin? Did I ever tell you I piss in the sink? I do. Sometimes if I'm really drunk, I just can't help it, and I hardly know where I am, and I piss in the sink. In the sink, for Christ's sake, in the sink! And in the art for these panels, we're seeing his face becoming horrified as he's saying this confession to the person on the phone. And Danny continues, I hadn't been able to stop myself. I had to say it. And John asks, like on the tube? And Danny answers, yeah, but it was just the start. Then we cut to a bunch of different scenes where he begins saying things out loud in public that he didn't want to say. The first one is of him yelling at his mother as he's throwing a plate in her house saying, I hate your bread pudding, Mother. I've always freaking hated it. I'm going home. And the second panel is of him standing on top of a table in a pub, and he's yelling out, I buy wank mags, kitty porn, bestiality, I'm a pervert. And of course, everybody in the pub is laughing and looking at him in disbelief. And the third and final example we have of his outbursts are of him walking up to two police officers, and he says, I scored last week, lads, 2 ounces, Jamaican, it blew me away. Then we cut back to Danny on the couch talking to John, and he says, it was the stuff I never told anyone, not even Daphne or Fee. The only one who knew about it was me and the diary. And at the story finishing, John takes a long drag of his cigarette and then puts it out in the ashtray next to him, and he says, all right, hang on. So far you've told me about your diary and a few daft things you get up to. Where does the magic come into it? And Danny answers, but don't you see? The diary is the only other one that knows. It's making me do it. But John doesn't get distracted by that. He says, unless you're going round the bend, let's hear about the magic. And Danny kind of looks up sheepishly at him and says, You do believe in this stuff? Really? And John answers, do I ever? Get on with it. And then Danny stands up and begins to pace around as he tells the rest of his story, saying, all the money for my house, my job, all my things, they didn't exactly come from hard work. And as Danny's remembering back, he's kind of staring with wide eyes at the middle distance, not focusing on anything in the house. And he remembers back to when he was younger, and we get a panel of him and his friends playing with a Ouija board, and the narration says, "It started at university. Me and a few mates got into some minor stuff. Nothing actually worked, but it was a laugh, something to do. I was the only one who got stuck with it. I got the feeling there was something better here than what everyday life could offer." And then we get a panel of him sitting in a room at night with a giant pile of books, and he's reading them by candlelight as he's smoking, and the narration continues. "It took me a month to understand a single page from the Grimoire." Then we get a panel of him standing shirtless in a room, and he's got a bunch of symbols painted on his chest, and it looks like he's chanting, and his story continues. "It was the last day of August, about 10 years ago. Really hot. I remember thinking we were in for an Indian summer. Its name was Triskele. It gave me luck, a golden touch in trade and finance, and all it cost me was eternal life. I told my diary that as well." And as he says this, Danny breaks down and begins to cry, and John looks over at him as he lights another cigarette, and he's kind of sad, and he thinks to himself, "What do I say to this idiot? This sad, stupid bastard who's fallen for the oldest trick. You never miss your soul till you sign it away." So John looks at Danny crying, and he feels pity on him. So he stands up, he begins to leave, and he says, "Okay, Danny, I'm going to do a bit of sniffing about. You stay here. Don't go out, just in case you start confessing your sins again." And then Danny starts to freak out and says, "What? Wait, don't leave me alone." And then he runs over to John and grabs onto his coat as John is trying to get ready to leave. And John says to him, "For Christ's sake, Danny, leave off. I'm going to try to find out about your demon, and then I'll see if it's the one making you spout out bits of your diary, okay? Sometimes they mess you about when you're under contract. They think it's funny. Now sit down and wait for me, and relax." Then we cut to John outside as he has left Danny's house, and he says out loud, "Jesus." Then we cut to John somewhere else. He's in some kind of storage unit, and the narration says, "My copy of the Grimoire's in Chaz's lockup. Kit doesn't like me keeping it at her flat, and Chaz told everyone down at the Red Rover I was under the thumb. I said I'd turn them all into frogs. No one dared laugh." And we see that Chaz is also in this storage room because it is Chaz's storage room, and he's giving John the keys and telling him to make sure that he does give Chaz back the set of keys. I mean, I know John and Chaz are friends, but, John can't really be trusted that much. So Chaz leaves, and John goes to look through all the stuff in this storage unit, and eventually he finds his copy of the Grimoire, and it is very much torn up, pages are falling out, and John thinks to himself, "Needs a little sellotape." And as the pages fall to the ground, he yells out, "Bollocks!" And then his narration continues, "But this copy has a bonus, Ben Cox's notes." And if you don't remember, Ben was one of John's friends. I believe he died in the story arc in Swamp Thing that Alan Moore wrote. And he was kind of like a bookworm that always had kind of occultic books and literature around. And apparently he did a lot of research for John. So as John reads through the notes, the narration says, "Ben read everything from the Satanic Bible to the Key of Solomon, and everything he found out about demons he noted in here. Thanks, Ben. Sorry." And as John is reading, he eventually gets to the demon that he's looking for because Danny did know the name of the demon, which was Triskele. So he finds that page, and as he reads it, we do see a picture, like an image of the demon, and we see this angelic face with the body of a snake skeleton, and that's wrapped around a bunch of dead human bodies. And John says out loud, "Bloody hell, you know how to pick 'em, Danny." So as he reads up on Triskele, his narration says, "Let's see. Triskele, worm queen of succubi, the bitch spirit that killed 100 seraphim. Jesus. What's this? A slayer of the archangel Dariel, whose face she tore off and wore as her own? Screw me, Danny. Why didn't you just go straight to the first of the fallen and have done with it?" And then John thinks for a second and calms down, and his narration continues. "Danny's such a little weird bastard anyway. I want to help him because I know how it feels to be this deep in shit, and I hate bloody demons. But the guy is so slimy and pathetic, and I get the feeling there's more to all this. Sod it. Read on. See what other surprises lie in store." So he continues reading, and eventually he gets to a part in the book that really reveals something. We don't know what, but we see his eye get super wide, and he says, "Shit." Then we cut back to Danny's house, and John is already at the door knocking on it, and Danny is saying, who's there?" And John says through the door, "Me, And then Danny replies, John? John Constantine? And I'm not sure why exactly it's such a surprise to him that John returned, but he did. And when he opens the door, John looks really pissed and he says, why aren't you in hell? And Danny seems confused and he says, what? But John cuts him off and kind of shoves his way through the door and he says, Triskele, Danny, she's a greedy bitch. She's famous for it. In fact, she never allows a mortal to keep his soul for more than 5 years. Once you sign the contract, the clock starts ticking. A hot August night 10 years ago, you said. How did you get an extra 5 years? And then John grabs Danny by the coat and Danny says, I'm not saying. I don't even know what you mean. And then he tries to push John away and says, just get the hell out of my house, all right? But when John doesn't move, Danny kind of gives up and John takes a second to light a cigarette and then he says, all right, Danny, all right. Why don't you tell me what you wrote in your diary on that hot August night? And then Danny's face lights up with terror and he looks up at John and screams, oh no, 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 no. And then John cuts him off and says, oh yes, it's easy, Danny. I'll start you off. Dear Diary. So basically what's going on is John is starting another one of Danny's confession cycles that was going on before. So Danny is compelled to confess. So he just starts by saying, I did it. Me. Triskele was coming and oh God, oh Jesus, what could I do? I was panicking. Daphne had found out about the girls. I mean, what did she expect? She was pregnant, for Christ's sake. She wouldn't let me near her. What was I supposed to do? It's like I said, I panicked. And then he falls to the ground, kind of weeping and holding himself, and he says, I wouldn't have done it otherwise. Then we cut to a flashback of the night that Triskele was coming for his soul 5 years after he sold it. And we see Danny vomiting in a sink, and his narration continues. The night arrived, and there was no escaping it. God, I was sick till my throat bled. Triskele was coming for me. And then we see Danny look up from the kitchen sink and see a bunch of kitchen knives, and he continues, me or something better, something I could give her, something she'd want that she'd accept instead. Daphne was just another freaking sinner, no good at all. But then I remembered our unborn child, our innocent unborn child. Then we get a panel of Danny carrying the body of his dead wife down the stairs into the basement. And then we see him in front of some kind of ceremonial circle on his knees, doing some kind of magic spell. And the narration continues. I cut her throat and ripped that child out of her. And Triskele licked him up like he was sugar. Then we cut back to the present where John is standing over Danny, who is curled up in a ball. And John says, 5 more years. And then he reaches out to the door handle next to him and he begins to open the door and he says, the cellar's through here, is it? And then Danny gets scared and says, what? Wait, don't go in there. But John doesn't listen and he forces his way through and he begins to walk down into the cellar saying, this is where you did it, Danny. A bit of privacy, easy to carry Daphne down here. Triskele's getting at you like I thought, using the diary. Why? And as John walks down the stairs, he turns on the light to the basement. And when he does, he sees a bassinet on top of a bunch of boxes down there. And as he gets to the bottom of the stairs, it is revealed that that bassinet is not empty or just full of blankets. A baby begins to cry. So John walks over to the bassinet and Danny says, not that, not that. But John doesn't pay him any mind and he just goes over to the baby crying and begins to try to comfort him and say, shh, be okay, be fine. Shush now. And then he picks the bassinet up and he says to Danny, Triskele's telling you your time's up again, isn't she? Is it tonight? And then Danny confesses, yes. Oh, Jesus, yes. And then John asks, where'd you nick the kid? And Danny replies, Covenant Garden. Some woman left the pram outside a cheese shop. But look. But John cuts him off because he doesn't have any time for this nonsense. And he begins to walk up the stairs with the bassinet, not looking at Danny. And he says, you better stay here, Danny. Because if you try to get out of this house tonight, I'll kill you. And then he walks out of the house. And then we cut to later that night when John is going to a pub. The baby is no longer in his arms. And he's meeting Chaz at the bar. And the narration says, I left the baby with the old Bill. Found her in an alley down near Covent Garden, Constable. Young women these days should face up to their responsibilities. Blah friggin' blah. Why did I even try to help that arsehole? And as John walks to the bar, The bartender asks John if he wants as usual a gin and tonic, but John is in the mood for something heavier, so he says, "Not tonight, Tom. Whiskey." And as John pounds that drink, his narration says, "Well, screw him. The little shit sold his soul. He murdered his wife. He sent an innocent to hell. For Christ's sake, he was going to do it again tonight. But a long time ago, in a place called Newcastle, so did I." And as John orders another whiskey, Chaz looks at him and says, "Rough night, John?" And John looks at Chaz with sunken eyes, and he says, "Yeah, Chaz, rough night." Then we cut back to Danny's house later that night, and Danny is in the basement crying as the demon Triskele appears in front of him, snake skeleton body and all, and says, "You've had your extra years, Danny. What'll you give me for 5 more? And Danny answers, I don't have anything. How could I? You messed up my mind. You knew my diaries, and you nearly sent me mad." And the demon replies, "It was hilarious. Nothing left then, Danny. All finished?" And Danny is silent, just weeping, and he thinks to himself, "All finished." And the demon continues, "Then there's only one thing left to say, Danny, and so to hell. Wonder what tomorrow will bring." And then the angelic-faced demon takes Danny's soul to hell. And that is the end of the issue. So if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains and comicbooks, all one word, @gmail.com. And we will see you on the next one.